Welcome to the chaos sector. Some DC agents have been flooding the comment section in our previous videos. I think they're hardwired to discredit the chaos because we exposed their beloved Get a Clue. They didn't appear until we addressed him, so yeah, you can't blend in. As you know by now, we have to address the nonsense. But moving on, I have a question for you all. If Moscow PD was asking for the public's help, is it fair for them to withhold information from that very public that helped them? Let that sit for a moment. If the public gave Moscow PD a tip regarding a specific vehicle that was identified, shouldn't they release the surveillance footage they have of that very vehicle? Well, in normal circumstances, where a suspect's vehicle is captured by surveillance, that is released to the media soon after. But for some reason, no footage has been released from the neighbor's security camera. Now, many may assume this is due to it being a residential camera instead of a business. Yeah, but no, there are no legal stipulations at play here, considering it would be visual evidence of a suspect's vehicle in a murder investigation. See, we are focusing on before Kohberger was arrested, and even after as well. Once Moscow PD obtained that camera footage, they reviewed it and went through the footage and selected what they would want to inform the public about, such as the very 2011 to 2013 white Hyundai Elantra they asked the public's help in spotting. Mind you, they obtained that surveillance a day later and also obtained the Linda Lane surveillance a day later. So they clearly examined all of the footage, yet never shared any of the information, which is visual information, with the public about the very vehicle they asked the public to help track down. Remember, asking the public for help in an investigation is essentially making them a part of the investigation. I think people don't really see it that way, but that's what it is. Yet they never did this. That has never happened in any case where there is surveillance footage capturing a, quote, person of interest in a specific vehicle. But once again, there was no one in the neighborhood, not even the neighbors who they got the footage from, who claimed to spot the white Hyundai Elantra. I mean, what is this about? The vehicle is driving in their neighborhood. They obviously know it's not a resident there due to its alleged creeping. So why didn't anyone from the neighborhood claim to spot the vehicle? We're not going to get back into that. Just wanted to point that out. Instead, let's address a few things that caught our attention. It seems we can't stop investigating just yet. We were watching Huda London's recent video, and something grabbed our attention. Now, Huda is a genuine person who we truly respect within the true crime community. So, shout out to Huda for all she has done. But we all recall Kaylee's mother claiming she was discovered deceased in the corner of Maddie's bedroom, right? Well, we didn't really get into it because we don't want to keep addressing the family and their statements, because it becomes very fuzzy if you catch my drift. We left a comment as followed, though, just to keep everyone balanced in how they're, quote, absorbing information from the families. Quote, the bedroom wasn't that tiny because it had a balcony, meaning Kaylee couldn't have been trapped in a corner because there was an escape route. Now, the more logical scenario of her being trapped would be there were multiple killers who rushed in and had both girls pinned. A lone killer can only attack one person at a time, so if Kaylee was the last one to be attacked, then she would have been watching Maddie be attacked instead of trying to fight back or escape. But with multiple killers, there's not much those girls could do. I believe the knife sheath belonged to one of those housemates, and the knife was immediately discarded due to an evidence trail. It may have been Maddie's, as she carried it with her that night. Wearing that oversized black coat, only her and Kaylee would know she had the knife. Then she tried to use it against the killers to save her life. And this is why the knife sheath was found alongside her body. The lone killer didn't walk out of that house with a bloody blade in his hand, and here's another element to that. If the lone killer has the knife in his hand, after stabbing those housemates, Dylan wouldn't be alive. He would go ahead and stab her to death as well, instinctively. So it seems the knife and knife sheath belonged to perhaps Maddie, because she was quite small. All of those housemates tried to fight back because there were multiple killers. Kohberger was framed due to knowing something related to the motive of those murders. Unquote. Now, for those who would say Kaylee was in Maddie's room, and it doesn't have the sliding doors, correct. But that balcony goes all the way around from Kaylee's room to Maddie's room. In the lone killer narrative, Kaylee would be pinned in the corner on the bed, as the lone killer is attacking Maddie. Now, of course, fear is a factor here, but I don't think Kaylee would just sit there while Maddie was being murdered. She would obviously scream, and that brings us back to the conflicting accounts from Dylan. In her official affidavit, there is no mention of Dylan hearing any screaming whatsoever. But in news articles, Dylan actually heard screaming as she thought the housemates were so-called partying. She goes on to tell them to, quote, quiet down as she was trying to sleep, unquote. Remember that? So we know she heard the screaming. Not only Kaylee's screams, but everyone's screams, including the victims on the floor she was on. But Kaylee was pinned in that corner due to multiple killers rushing into Maddie's bedroom. I must say this, though. We don't know if Kaylee was actually in Maddie's room. You know, this case has already proven that nothing can be trusted. Katie, who was Kaylee's friend, stated on live television that she tried to contact Kaylee around 10 a.m. to see if she was all right. Yet, why and how would Katie know of any harm towards Kaylee at this time when it was reported that 12 p.m. is when those housemates were discovered deceased? And what about the reports of where Ethan's body was discovered? One claims he was discovered in Xana's bed, and another claims he was discovered in the hallway. You see, so we don't truly know what physically unfolded, how it unfolded, and when it unfolded. What if Kaylee was in fact in her own bedroom with Murphy? And when the danger entered the home, then she went into Maddie's room. We don't know how anything unfolded leading up to those murders. But we do know that both girls made emergency phone calls. The narrative of Kaylee being trapped in a corner doesn't sit right with me based on it being a lone killer. There is too much time to think of a plan because Kaylee would be observing Maddie be attacked. So she would either try to jump on the killer's back, to save Maddie. That's her best friend, so she's definitely doing something. Or, if she was so frightened, she would more than likely try to escape and seek out help from neighbors. There was a small nightstand right next to the bed. She could have grabbed it and threw it at the lone killer. There was even a chair at Maddie's table, screaming. Kaylee would grab something and try to fight off the attack on Maddie. Kaylee's fear is understandable, but instinctively, I would assume she would try to help her best friend at some point. Remember, she is observing this, and even in those moments of fear, survival instincts kick in. Kaylee's parents even claimed that she fought. So she fought for her life, but sat and watched Maddie be murdered. Don't think so. The point to that so-called trapped in a corner scenario is Kaylee would do something, and it wouldn't be sitting there as Maddie was being attacked. But let's cover all of the bases in this scenario. Let's say Maddie was quickly dealt with, and it was somewhat of a surprise. Well, the thing is, how does the lone killer reach this bedroom without the girls knowing he is heading upstairs? Mind you, they both made phone calls to Jack, either one at this point, and it was obviously an emergency. Now, putting those phone calls into context, we suggest that Kaylee and Maddie were aware of danger at some point. That's why they were making those calls. So, the more logical scenario of Kaylee essentially being pinned in that corner is there were multiple killers. They both called about the danger, and it was fast approaching upstairs. And in this scenario, it's difficult for Kaylee to help Maddie if Kaylee herself is also being attacked by another perpetrator, you see? Kaylee and Maddie knew they were in danger, and they knew the killers, or at least knew why they were in the house as threats. And this is why they called Jack, either one, because Jack knew something about whatever linked them to that danger. It's more logical it was Jack Showalter. At least initially. We have always assumed it was Jack Showalter because it was this Jack who had warned the girls earlier that night. As the danger approaches, the girls immediately call the Jack who warned them of a danger, or that danger. They may have not truly grasped the danger he warned them about, but then realized it, and of course would reach out to him as someone to help them. Okay, now that strayed us off a bit, but hold on to that point. Let's go back for a moment. If the mainstream media depicted Kaylee and Maddie being murdered first, then they would be the targets, right? So for Ethan and Xana to also be murdered, then they would either be associated with the motive of targeting Kaylee and Maddie, or they simply tried to help. But if they tried to help in the lone killer narrative, surely that would not be merely 9 minutes of the lone killer's time in that home. There would definitely be a struggle that consists of a healthy, tall, and athletic male in Ethan and a feisty girlfriend in Xana. The lone killer is not just stabbing them once and heading out of that home unscathed. there would be DNA all over that house, which for some reason didn't exist. And there was, but they figured a criminology student justifies the lack of DNA in the home. Yeah, nice try. In reality, there was so much DNA of the killers. Yes, killers. They immediately vaulted everything, like those 3 males who were at the home. And trust me, their DNA was fresh. That's right, it was fresh DNA, and the prosecution is concealing this discovery from the defense. We went over this, but again, yet, it doesn't add up that Kaylee and Maddie were murdered first. Because they made phone calls due to the danger, meaning they were aware of the danger downstairs and tried to call Jack. So it's more logical that they were last, at least in my opinion, because the phone calls indicate it was in response to a danger that existed on a floor below. Now we get to the knife sheath issue. Just examining photos of Maddie, she appeared to be about 5'6" and about 120 pounds. That's very petite and a very easy target for males. It makes all the sense in the world for her to have some form of self-defense, and that would be a good old knife to poke the hell out of some aggressive male. Yeah, Kaylee may have had one too. I always wondered why she had that oversized coat on that night. It just looked off, you know? It could be because she had a knife on her waist the entire time and didn't want anyone to know it. But the purpose for having that knife could be a combination of things. Knowing she's quite small and involved in some type of danger Jack warned her about. So, wear this oversized coat tonight to conceal this knife, and if anyone tries to fuck with me, I'm giving them a few pokes.
Maybe we need to go back and examine every piece of that grub truck surveillance to see if we can spot the knife sheath. That would completely flip the entire case upside down. They gave 2 different physical locations of that knife sheath, and everyone raised an eyebrow, of course. It's near her body, yet it's slightly underneath her body. These are 2 specific locations on that bed. And it would appear that the reason for this is the knife sheath didn't belong to a killer. And because it didn't belong to a killer, they are trying to figure out which location on the bed would be convincing in relation to how the attacks unfolded. Because a killer leaving the knife sheath, like mentioned, means they left the home with the knife in their hand. Keep in mind, the rush from committing this massacre is flowing through the lone killer's veins. He would be walking back to his vehicle with the knife in his hand, opens the door with one hand, yet there would be blood on that glove, holding the knife in the other hand, gets into the vehicle, again closing the door with blood on that glove, while holding the knife in the other hand. And then now he has to get rid of the evidence. Already it's very difficult for a lone killer to even think straight at this point, because he realizes he has all of this evidence dumped on him and on his vehicle. Okay, now obviously he didn't dump any of this evidence near the crime scene. It would have been found. So he places the bloody knife perhaps inside the armrest area and drives off with bloody gloves on. Then when he is far away from the crime scene, such as back in Pullman, he dumps the knife in the river or in a dumpster behind an alley, whatever. Now, some may believe this is the tactical work of Kohberger, but they confiscated his vehicle and there was no DNA reported to be discovered in that vehicle. I repeat, there was no DNA reported to exist in his vehicle. But if he drove home with bloody gloves on and even the knife would have blood dripping from it, where was the blood in his vehicle? You can't bleach away the traces of DNA. It's impossible. There will be traces of blood left behind. On the door handle, the trunk, the steering wheel obviously, the armrest, the driver's seat, the gas and brake pedals. And this so-called deep cleaning of his vehicle, someone would have spotted it, yet nobody in Pullman claimed to see a man cleaning his car religiously, or even at the car wash. But of course, they obtained a single source of trace DNA of Kohberger's family tree, so there's that. But behold, they couldn't find a single source of DNA in his vehicle when it was, quote, a rolling crime scene described by a former FBI official. If you discovered a single source of his DNA on a damn button of a knife sheath, surely there would be all types of traces of DNA in the rolling crime scene, that being the white Hyundai Elantra. Yet in Moscow, some witnessed a man bleaching his red Mustang sometime after the murders, and even a forensics team was there to inspect it. No report of what they discovered, yet the authorities were called, and there was a goddamn forensics team there. But Moscow PD came out and claimed that vehicle had nothing to do with the murders. Really? Well, does anyone know what are the results of the forensic analysis of that vehicle? Let me guess, it's been vaulted. I broke all of that down to say this. Maddie tried to stab the fucker, and the killers took that knife. They weren't concerned about the sheath because it didn't belong to their weapons. From their perspective, there is nothing that links them to the sheath, so they had no need to take it. But that knife Maddie had, oh yeah, they definitely took that because it had their DNA on it.
Exactly. They didn't care about the sheath. Maddie knew how to use the knife for sure, and she at least cut or stabbed someone in her defense. They couldn't leave the knife, obviously, so they took it. See, if that knife was left, it would appear to be exactly what we've broke down. Maddie had the knife and tried to defend herself, but it would also introduce DNA from the actual killers. Blood from the killer's cuts, or even stab wounds, would be on the blade. It's also possible that, considering the element of Maddie being quite fragile, and Kaylee, although weighs more, those killers were perhaps football-sized males. They perhaps didn't even have weapons, just expected to go in and strangle them to death. Maybe that was the initial plan. Because strangling someone to death is swifter, quieter, and definitely the attempt to scream would be quickly snuffed out. It takes approximately 1 minute to strangle someone to death. But when Maddie whipped out the knife, it changed the plans a bit. They could have used her own knife against her and then against Kaylee. Interesting possibility to ponder as well. We did present this as a possibility prior, and now that we address it again, it seems that was the plan. Based on death by strangulation, it's still brutal, but with strangulation, there is less likelihood DNA would be left behind. The only noise heard would be the initial screams, a dog barking, and then complete silence after the housemates were strangled. Clean, quick, and casually walk back out of that house as if nothing happened. Huda mentioned Saeed and what he was viewing on his phone. But something I noticed in the body cam footage was the size of his hands. That guy has bare hands. He definitely could strangle Maddie with no problem. Maybe he should be checked to see if he has any cuts.
Some would still believe Kohberger left it in his haste. I just explained the complexities of him trying to flee the scene with knife in hand. In addition, since they claim the murders were swift, approximately 10 minutes, Kohberger would have the time to grab that knife sheath before he left that room. He would obviously see the sheath after taking care of Kaylee, right? He would be heading towards the bedroom door, passing the bed, with Maddie laying there, and the knife sheath just sitting there. Oh, he wanted to leave it to see if they could track him down. Well, no need to rely on the knife sheath. His damn vehicle, being a light bulb at night, would do the job just fine. Not too smart, hey Kohberger? If he was playing the classic serial killer games with detectives, he would not drive a light bulb to commit the murders. He would drive a dark vehicle that would be extremely difficult to identify at night. And even if it were identified, his actual vehicle would be a white Hyundai Elantra. So detectives would be searching for a dark vehicle, and it would possibly take quite some time to even identify the vehicle, let alone trace it back to a specific person. And by that time, heck, Kohberger would perhaps have, get this, gone back to his hometown, and it would have taken even longer to find him, perhaps years, maybe a few years. Isn't that how most of those serial killers get caught? Of course. So, the whole mastermind rhetoric is the complete opposite, and there was no reported DNA discovered in his vehicle, which means there was no trace of evidence that linked him to the crime. By way of a trail of blood particles you simply can't completely clean away. Again, the eyes can't see what forensic technology can see. That blood particle on the steering wheel in that little crevice, that's something that would be spotted by forensics, while the killer wipes it down, thinking they got every area that their hands touched. So Maddie had a knife, which is understandable. It's logical for all of those housemates to have some type of defense. Remember, the only male that stayed there had moved out, and Ethan didn't stay there. Xana's father came to repair the lock on her door, perhaps more about her privacy with her boyfriend, but also due to so many people in and out of that house when her boyfriend wasn't around. So it was a house consisting of all females. Many males frequented that house for parties. Surely there was some, quote, aggression from time to time. The black coat was found near the fire hydrant, and that kind of puzzled us, because it indicated that Maddie was physically in that area at some point. Some have suggested it was a symbolic message that the job had been done, as that was the coat Maddie had on, and since it was there, Maddie had been dealt with. Some have claimed there is no proof that that was the same black coat Maddie had on. Well, we examined it, and it had the same white patch or rip in the fabric seen on Maddie's coat in the grub truck footage. It was the same coat, and the detectives knew it was the same coat. That's why he tried to sort of hide from the camera.
Looking back at that actual video footage from the mainstream media, the detective takes something out of the coat and appears to place it back on the ground. If we all come to the conclusion that that was the coat Maddie was wearing, and obviously detectives viewed that grub truck footage and came to the same conclusion, well, what more do we have to prove this was a cover-up? Whatever he took out of that coat is evidence, and since it was never established that it was Maddie's coat, we definitely don't know what that item was. How dare that detective conceal evidence like that? This is why we stay on them like flies on, let me calm down. It's the same coat, yet it was never reported that detectives found that coat. Now, how do you discover one of the victim's clothing on Taylor and not report it to the media or be included in the evidence collected? Because that coat was placed there after the murders, which proves the killers were not only close but also knew the area to even place the coat specifically right in that area. It wasn't left there by accident. Oh no.
There were multiple killers who entered that home. Based on our analysis, Ethan and Xana were dealt with first. Kaylee and Maddie had attempted to reach Jack Showalter and were dealt with soon after the final phone call. It was speculated that Jack Showalter moved to Africa after the murders. Some have so-called debunked it, but how could such a specific claim come about unless there is something relative to Africa? Furthermore, who debunked it? It would have to be someone who is associated with that college circle and can prove that Showalter didn't flee the country. Is there photo proof? Is there video proof? The people who are so-called debunking that claim haven't provided any proof that he hasn't fled to Africa. So until you prove it, you can't debunk it. And that brings about the question, where did the claim he fled to Africa even come from? Let me guess, he told someone, and they told someone else.
Headed to the motherland to avoid being arrested? Or headed to the motherland to get away from all of the madness? We lean more towards Showalter being a witness more so than being a suspect. Although, we must admit, he has a bit of sketchy issues going on, such as the photo of him hunting and allegedly being accused of sexual assault. But the more clean-cut ex-boyfriend would seem to be more suspicious, even with all of that so-called supportive evidence to suggest Showalter is a suspect. The ex-boyfriend would have a motive, would know that his ex is leaving for good, and could have harbored bitter emotions about that. If it were the ex who were called and he never answered, that in itself raises suspicions about him, specifically. While Showalter not answering the phone in connection to his prior warning to the girls is him basically deciding to stay away from everything. A bit cruel, but he did warn them, and maybe that's all he could do. Why was Jack with them that night? Could it be that he knew they were in danger? Or was he spying on them, pretending to be their big bro the night on the town? We can also suggest that both Jacks were involved. That's just as logical. But the point to this episode is that it appears to us at least that the knife sheath belonged to one of the victims, and the knife was taken from the crime scene to ensure there was no trail back to the real killers. We know Maddie had on jeans, and perhaps also a belt. A knife sheath clamped onto her clothing is logical. Mind you, the medical examiner described different types of injuries, indicating there were different weapons used. If there were different weapons used, then there were multiple killers. And if there were multiple killers, then surely they wouldn't leave a knife sheath behind. Mind you, their DNA would be on that knife sheath, and their motive is different from the lone killer's motive, which places them more than likely in Moscow. In other words, it was someone they knew, as Kaylee's mother had a feeling about. Yet it was left behind, which suggests that it didn't belong to any of their weapons, rather the victim. It's very logical that this is a secret that determines literally everything in trial. Did Kohberger pry the sliding doors open? So he would have had to use a tool to pry those doors open. Okay. Well, he better work pretty fast because there is a porch light glaring right on that activity, and surely someone would spot him breaking into the home. Dylan claimed to hear one of her housemates state, quote, "There's someone here," unquote. Now, it is suggested that this was Kaylee who stated that. Alrighty, obviously talking to Maddie upstairs. But in that affidavit, the authorities injected their own so-called speculations about who that could possibly be, suggesting it could have also been Xana who made that statement due to her cell phone activity. This was filler, distracting you from the next chain of events, so we scratch that out. Okay, Dylan hears Kaylee say there's someone here. The next account was Dylan opening her door to check to see if anyone was there. This means Dylan was concerned about someone being in the house, right? This is the setting. Kaylee, Maddie, and Dylan are concerned about someone being in the house. Okay, now the next account was Dylan opening her door for the second time after what she assumed was crying coming from Xana's bedroom. Dylan heard a male's voice saying, quote, "It's okay, I'm here to help you," unquote. Mind you, Dylan has her door open at this point. The next line in the affidavit is more filler, addressing the security camera next door, a distraction from the chain of events. So we scratch that out of Dylan's accounts once again. The next account was Dylan opening her door for a third time after she heard the crying, and this is when she encountered the alleged Coburger. What is the point to all of this? In this affidavit, there is not mention of Dylan closing her door, but it makes an effort to say she opened her door. Now, one would say, well, obviously she closed her door to open it, right? Not so fast. The wording is key here. The reason it never stated she closed her door is because, well, she never closed her door. She had it cracked. And that puts her in a position of being aware of what was going on. You understand, with the door cracked, it's easy to, quote, open the door because all you're doing is opening it further than what it was. They wanted to make it appear she did in fact have it closed and then opened it due to the activity. With this scenario, she's not keeping track of what's going on, like the scenario of her having the door cracked. We broke this down in a previous episode. Read between those very deceptive lines, my friends. If the door is cracked, then she is keeping track of everything that the affidavit claims she was being alerted by. The difference here in a nutshell: opening the door means she is opening the door out of intrigue about the activity in the home, while having the door cracked means she has a full ear's worth of activity to keep track of. You understand? She had the door cracked and keeping track of what's going on. Again, Dylan had the door cracked, listening to everything. She didn't open her door after hearing her housemate crying. Nope. She had the door cracked and was listening. Yes, listening to Xana crying. Oh, this is slander? Oh, this is accusing her of being involved in the murders? This is breaking down the affidavit and its oddities. So blame the affidavit of her accounts. We're only the messenger here. But also, if we go based on her not being aware of any danger, such as a lone killer in the house, when she heard what she thought was crying, from one of her housemates, by the way, why didn't she go check on her housemate to see if she was okay? I mean, wouldn't you go check on your housemate, and we assume your friend, if you heard her crying in her bedroom? Of course you would. So the affidavit is protecting someone who conspired against her housemates. Oh, chaos, there is no proof of that. There you go with wild speculations and accusations. Really? Well, the authorities did not provide the public with Dylan's whereabouts prior to the murders. Off that alone, she is a potential suspect. I recall Kaylee's mother stating they cleared some individuals too soon. Well, based on what we have broken down thus far, we can suggest that Kaylee's mother is talking about Dylan and others as well. But that element of keeping certain things to yourself is a very sticky situation to be in. If you know something, when do you decide to say something? Nevertheless, truth will always be the final arbiter, and if they didn't provide this proof of her whereabouts, yet it is Dylan's accounts that have been officially released as what unfolded that night, clearly the authorities are covering up the truth behind those murders. And if we can all agree to that, then that knife sheath is not from a lone killer, because there was never a lone killer, based on just Dylan's whereabouts not being provided. You see? And if it's not the lone killer's knife sheath, then based on what we broke down, it's possible that it was a knife sheath to the knife one of the victims had for protection. Because apparently that was a dangerous house. May have not appeared to be based on the TikTok videos of everyone having a good time and all the photos the mainstream media provided to the public, but inside that house, there was turmoil, anxiety, paranoia, suspicions, distrust, jealousy, and ultimately betrayal. And then you have the danger that the girls were warned about. We keep reiterating how important this is to the investigation. Maddie basically went down trying to protect her and her best friend. The knife was her best defense. I believe she slept with that knife. Mind you, Kaylee had moved out already, so Maddie's best friend was no longer living there. So Maddie was staying upstairs alone. That's interesting. It makes all the sense in the world. She would have a knife for protection. Fucking right. And of course, the so-called survivors were spared due to their compliance. But see, the thing is, Bethany just doesn't seem to be that type of person, you know? I think she got the hell out of there. She may have known something, and of course, it's hard to say or do anything to help. Some would say, well, we can say the same about Dylan. It was hard for her to help. Well, if that were the case, then her whereabouts would have been provided just like Bethany's was. Sorry, not the same situation, because it's not the same type of person. Remember, it is reported that Bethany never went upstairs the following morning when the housemates were discovered, quote, unconscious. So Dylan never notified Bethany about the housemates? Well, she couldn't. because Bethany had already gotten the hell out of there. That's why the front door was open. Yep, all throughout the night, that door was wide open, and surely Dylan didn't know about it because she was too preoccupied with the fucking deceased bodies on the second and third floor. Bethany snuck out the house and never came back. And the only reason they got matching tattoos is because, well, she's dangerous. You have to go along with her plan after you ran off. You better do this or else. Bethany had no choice, because it's for her fallen housemates for one, and she is basically being threatened. After this, she left Moscow and got away from the damn demon child. To keep Bethany and Dylan joined at the hip, the prosecution and the FBI demanded that Bethany's attorney keep her from testifying. This would separate them from each other, because whatever alleged exculpatory evidence Bethany had would automatically contradict Dylan's accounts. Without that testimony, they can keep Bethany and Dylan together and even claim they were texting each other during the attacks. Now, what in the hell did this report lead to? Did it lead to them being questioned by the authorities? Did it lead to the authorities reinvestigating the case, implementing new evidence into the equation? Nope. Somehow the mainstream media can claim that there is evidence that they were texting each other during the attacks and murders, yet this groundbreaking information or evidence just evaporates into nothing. Can't claim they were texting each other during the murders when one of them got the hell out of there before the murders took place. I'm going to take a wild guess here. Bethany witnessed the suspects entering or heard multiple suspects. The attacks followed. She got the hell out of there, but not before she could prove that there were multiple killers in a testimony. Like we mentioned, the prosecution would throw them both under the bus to prevent the exculpatory evidence from coming out. Making that claim about the surviving housemates essentially means they were complicit with those murders, but only one of them was, while the other one got out of there. To protect the lies of Dylan's affidavit, to deflect from the fact that they literally concealed her whereabouts, which is protecting her, they need Bethany to accompany the in-house conspirator. Because if Dylan is all by herself in her accounts of what happened, she would be in a sticky situation, just like the sticky situation Bethany left her in once she skipped town. Karma is Yeah, we've reached that point the chase begins.
Let me add to that. I think the reason the narrative was Kaylee and Maddie were murdered first is it justifies that knife sheath being discovered in her bedroom, which is of course concealing the truth about it actually belonging to one of the victims in that bedroom. They had no choice but to acknowledge it was discovered there, but they changed the chronological order of the attacks. Let me elaborate. If Zaina was reported to have put up a fierce fight, where she almost had her fingers cut off, that physical encounter would more than likely lead to the knife sheath popping off the suspect's waist. And of course, they just eliminated Ethan from being a factor, as they never clarified if he was asleep or not. We broke that down, which contradicts the lone killer narrative as well. So, the narrative was that the lone killer snuck past the second floor, went upstairs and murdered Kaylee and Maddie, and left behind a knife sheath, then decides to take out Ethan and Xana. Now, how did this unfold? It would have to be the housemate's defense, as Ethan, if he was asleep, would have definitely awakened to the massacre. So they are prepared to fight, and if scared, they would lock the door and call 911. Translation: Ethan and Xana were murdered first. Kaylee and Maddie had called Jack, and soon they were murdered. But Maddie had a knife and tried to fight to survive. The killers, didn't have a knife sheath. I believe they did have weapons. It's possible there were two types of attacks also. One attack for the housemates on the second floor, and another attack for the housemates on the third floor. Remember, there's no way that the alleged Coburger would know Ethan was at that home, let alone anyone else who would popped up. But individuals in that area, tracking those housemates' movement and activities, would know, especially if someone in that house gave them all the information they needed. Mind you, Dylan's whereabouts were not provided. And we don't sugarcoat here. We came to the conclusion she actually never left the house or came right back. Knowing Ethan would be there, a weapon was used on him to quickly take the muscle out, leaving the females with no male defense. The reports did the same thing. I mean, there's no way Ethan was asleep if they claim Maddie and Kaylee were murdered first. You see? Damage control. Just wanted to bring it home a bit faster.
Over the course of our investigation, we had this growing suspicion that the mainstream media was trying to push the narrative that Kaylee was the target. But we never bought into that belief, and it raises the question, why would they attempt to create the motive of Kaylee being targeted? To be honest, that seems like deflection from something. But nothing they pushed would explain why 4 victims were murdered, And on top of that, Dylan allegedly just watched the lone killer walk right past her. It doesn't add up, the whole stalking narrative. Even employees claimed the girls mentioned something about being stalked. The mainstream media claimed that Kaylee had been concerned about being stalked. Yet, in connection to the suspect in custody, there hasn't been any evidence provided to show that Kohberger had stalked Kaylee. But the mainstream media claimed there was digital evidence proving Kohberger stalked those housemates. If they make this claim, you might as well forget about some gag order concealing that evidence, because now the information or evidence has been publicly reported on, yet nothing has surfaced. I can't put my finger on it, as to why it's being alluded to, Kaylee being the target. It just feels like a distraction from something else. I guess it's due to the ex-boyfriend. The family even tried to execute damage control. But apparently the father didn't trust him and may have suspected him of being involved. That's the thing, though. Even if the ex-boyfriend was involved, there were 4 victims, one survivor who obviously conspired, and another who apparently has exculpatory evidence. And we know Bonnie ordered the so-called DoorDash for Xana, which suggests the primary motive was drug-related. This DoorDash driver was never identified. The private driver was identified as some guy named Eric Grower. Nobody knows who in the world that is. If it was a misspelling of Moscow's Eric Gower, then who was the person interviewed by Law and Crime claiming to be the private driver, staying 1,200 feet from Kohberger's doorstep in Pullman? Neither one of these individuals were the private driver. Based on our analysis of the grub truck footage, we came to the conclusion that the individual who picked the girls up drove a Mustang. We examined the headlights and the classic 3 slat taillights of Mustangs and came to that conclusion. And of course, we suggested the same red Mustang, found crashed and abandoned, with forensic techs swarming it, was the so-called private driver. This same vehicle was spotted by neighbors, being cleaned, and the smell of bleach covered the vehicle. All of this plotting and scheming is bigger than just some scorned ex-boyfriend, but it doesn't mean he wasn't involved as well. This was clearly a planned attack, targeting those 4 housemates, not just Kaylee. And then there's another element to why Kaylee has been focused on the most. And let's be honest, Kaylee has been the center of this case. Maybe Kaylee's family knew whose knife sheath it was, and to distract from that, they became the most vocal. Therefore, Kaylee became subconsciously focused on the most. Mind you, there was no evidence of Kaylee being stalked or targeted. Yet, her photos and her family are focused on the most out of the 4 victims and their families. Why is her family out in front the most? Is it because they know that the knife sheath belonged to Maddie, therefore the murder weapon is actually Maddie's used for her protection? Kaylee and Maddie were best friends, so they would know if she had a knife? Because she was basically another daughter, they knew the alleged murder weapon was actually the victim's protection, but they're stuck because they can't say anything about it.
There is something eerie about Maddie's coat near that fire hydrant, which everyone coincidentally seemed to be standing next to around the same time frame those phone calls were being made. If the coat was there and it wasn't spotted in the body cam footage, then it was placed there after the murders. Now we checked that body cam footage and we didn't see the coat nowhere near the fire hydrant, and we were definitely searching for it prior when we addressed the coat. So this pretty much eliminates the scenario of Maddie throwing the coat near that area on her way back home. Now, this would mean someone had to get that coat from the house and bring it to Taylor Road. This would be a symbolic or even a ritualistic message. Seems like it. And that just proves there were multiple killers, and the knife sheath didn't belong to a so-called lone killer. But following up with my take, the danger enters the home. Kaylee and Maddie couldn't get in touch with Jack. They hear the footsteps coming up the stairs, and Maddie pulls out her knife in attempts to defend herself and Kaylee. They bum-rush the bedroom. Maddie tries to stab them. She's pushed onto the bed and is stabbed with her own knife. The knife sheath is on the bed, and well, that's that. It belonged to one of the victims. The killers didn't think of grabbing it because they were perhaps so focused on getting out of the house as quickly as possible. Meanwhile, the lone killer scenario, you can't say Kohberger was so focused on getting out of the house as quickly as possible because he went into a house he observed 5 vehicles parked at. No bueno. In addition, if Kohberger was so calm and calculated, where he took the time to actually communicate to the victims in saying, quote, "It's okay, I'm here to help you," Pretty sure he was calm and focused enough to grab the knife sheath from the bed. But he wouldn't be that calm anyway. That statement was from someone else, perhaps the authorities. But the point, Kohberger wouldn't have left that knife sheath if he wanted to commit the so-called perfect crime. No other evidence places him at the scene of the crime. No cell phone pings, not even the light bulb at night. But the killers, who knew exactly whose vehicles those were and could control the situation based on their numbers, got in and got out before anything could go wrong.
Remember, the knife sheath was the source of identifying Kohberger, right? But it wasn't his knife sheath, it was Maddie's, which belonged to the knife the killers obviously took with them. Kaylee's family knew whose knife sheath that was, but couldn't say anything about it, because that completely, well, like mentioned, would have turned the case upside down. So they kept quiet about it. Now, this is our theory, but as with all our theories, it's based on logical analysis. Talk about exculpatory evidence, hey? This is the Chaos Sector.